trying to get you folks to understand this is how the smoke and mirrors works. I just simply want to find out what happened to the American dream as someone who is living the American nightmare. You got to know the facts. And if we came together, we could overcome the corruption that's murdering us all.
I'm just trying to make the world aware of the truth. And I've got it.
And a lot on display last night. Of course, President Zelensky's historic speech in Congress last night regarding the aid to Ukraine in the face of the onslaught of the Russian war, I should say, or invasion, and all that constitutes, which of course has led to a outcry specifically from the right that's just really incredible for those of us who have lived since the 80s, for example, because in this particular case, it's the Republicans that are allies of Russia. And what were the other? Oh yeah, and you know the other stuff that seems to be like abetting on TikTok or Twitter, I should say, is this just unbelievable sort of like conspiracy-minded revelations of the Twitter files that ultimately lead to what the FBI may have been involved with in censorship, and then that has led to this sort of right-wing, outcry that the FBI needs to be muzzled or controlled, and yet everybody in the FBI is a Republican. And so I'm hearkening back to Ronald Reagan, in the 80s, like, wait a second. So the Republicans in 22 are going to be with the Russians and against the FBI? That's insane. And then in addition to that, I think we saw Tucker Carlson align with, obviously, the likes of Oliver Stone over the course of decades, intrinsically comparing what took place during the JFK assassination, because it was recently released 13,000 documents that Biden released, much of which were redacted. But, that seemed to implicate, in fact, it wasn't even implicate. There was like this sort of smoke and mirrors trick of this monologue that Tucker Carlson gave that's going viral, where millions of people were paying attention to it, where he made the claim that he had talked to somebody inside the agency, i.e. the CIA, that had said, yes, he believes, I think you could do air quotes, that the CIA was involved with the assassination of Kennedy. He slipped that in, and everybody's response to it is like, oh my God, Tucker Carlson is revealing that he got the information from someone deep inside the deep state that the CIA murdered or assassinated President Kennedy. And suddenly the right, who back in those days would have been all over J. Edgar Hoover's FBI and complicit in all of those things that led to that scenario. And it's not funny. It's just that there's this sort of twisted, almost insane, perverted logic and rhetoric that continues to unfold that just, it's the emperor's new clothes over and over and over. The right is incredibly well-funded, incredibly skilled at being able to create and live and thrive in the world of paranoia, even though what they're revealing is exactly what they've been a part of for decades. And more, interestingly enough, in the con, for example, and I brought this up on Twitter the other day, but you see this confluence, like one of the hot button issues, of course, with Republicans or the right. I don't even know if you can actually put them together. It's like saying the left and Democrats. It's not quite the same thing. There's this MAGA movement that's, aspects of it are incredibly volatile and extreme and aggressive and violent and that sort of thing, of course, leading to the insurrection. Much of these guys were insurrectionists. I should say mercenaries or police officers or anybody that might skew into a direction of authoritarianism, which gets us closer and closer to that day where the fascist state prevails. And that's what we're up against. And that's what I've been fighting from day one, but in a whole variety of ways. Someone this morning asked me, so what exactly is your framing of what our system has become? And it was a T-ball. It was a complete underhanded softball for me, because this is what I've been saying for now years. We live in a corporate fascist state, and now that's redundant because corporate fascism and autocracy is really a similar top-down approach where everybody is complicit to the aims of that particular organization. So it's a corporate fascist state, but here's the key consideration: undergirded by a criminal syndicate. which means conspiracy. So here we have the right that's going into this sort of play where it's like, well, it's no longer conspiracy theory, and they're actually right. In the case of the CIA, yeah, I believe, and I have for decades, well, I don't know about decades, but more so than ever before, especially after seeing Oliver Stone's most recent work on the JFK assassination, that it looks absolutely crystal clear that the CIA had planned and operated, executed, was extremely involved in sophisticated operation, where the evidence appears that there was like literally 3 Lee Harvey Oswalds in Dallas verticals, one being in Chicago and the other in Miami, that were like fail-safes for this organization. And that was like gobsmacking when I learned that information. But you kind of think about this, and I'll never forget, I did an interview with one of the top journalists who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who works at the New York Times and does writing for like the Atlantic and Vanity Fair and others. And I remember putting him in a cab after I interviewed him, and he, as the door is closing, he looks up to me and he says, well, the day it all changed was the day Kennedy was assassinated. And I was like, holy shit, here's a guy that writes like James Michener-like novels that have more detail, and everything is just completely concrete in terms of the evidence that he presents. And 1,600-page, absolute, it almost confounds the mind to be able to try to quantify the amount of information that people at that level of journalism are able to provide, that's absolutely detailed and just completely bulletproof. And he says to me as he's getting into the cab, the day it all changed was the day that Kennedy was assassinated. Now, I've done a lot of introspection and investigation, and I've just been following the thread of what the CIA has been involved with for a very long time. And I personally, for those of you who listen to what I have to talk about for some time, I'm obsessed with 9/11 through 2008, 2008 being my expertise. Not quite sure what to think of COVID, all things considered, other than I'm vaccinated 3 times. And of course, I'm not dead. And I know that COVID killed millions of people and it was legit, but there's other questions. But what I do know during that time period is what happened at the Federal Reserve and all of the different intricacies of quantitative easing during this time period. that further is what we reveal from the con, which is the story of everything. And what's incredible as we see all of these things start to unfold is this clarity that mainstream knows where it gets its bread buttered. Same with Congress. There is a funding mechanism where there is a power behind that power that fuels and funds how things operate in this country. And what's most shocking to me, quite frankly, is that the mainstream media, specifically the New York Times, has been complicit in everything that's been going on since 2008. Now, it's extremely sophisticated at how it handles this, but really at the end of the day, when you know the facts, you can just compare and contrast what the New York Times hasn't done when you understand what was available at what time and what they ignored for what outcome, and actually what they published at that time, to be able to create kind of a national consensus, which is important because the New York Times, being the nation's paper of record, is an influencer of all influencers, because all mainstream media will follow the lead of the New York Times to be able to kind of give us an understanding of the world we actually live in. And I am very critical, and I watch mostly to study, not to get information, but to study, because I know a lot of what they're leaving out over and over, the likes of Rachel Maddow and the MSNBC team, if you will. And they're incredibly capable and sophisticated and charming and smart, but they cherry pick what they want us to know. It's safe to go after Trump, and Trump is guilty beyond anything that we have seen. There's so much on Trump. It's shocking to me that he's still breathing free air. But in context to what Trump has done and is guilty of, he's at best a mid-level player at what I continue to reveal to you. So I'm going to give you a couple of contexts for consideration and clarification, and so you can kind of compare apples to apples at what it is that you need to know. But I'll also, give you another metaphor, because it's very difficult for, I think, a lot of people to really just slow down, open up their mind, get their bandwidth in a focus where they're listening to the source, and in this case, me. And I don't have tens of millions of followers, and nor do I have the most, let's say, impactful influencers in the country saying, you got to listen to Patrick Lovell because he's the guy with all the answers. Unfortunately, I don't have that yet, but that is actually coming, believe it or not. and I'm 6 months ahead of you in terms of what I know is coming. And I'm finally, after years and years and years, building a consensus to be able to build that tidal wave to blast through like a nuclear, fusion, like a reactor almost, of truth that's going to ultimately break through. And it's going to have everybody just, this plastic Teflon sort of separation between reality of the world that constitutes the power structure of this country gets unveiled. Because like I continue to tell you, it is the emperor's new clothes. And I like to say on really bad acid because that's what it is. But here's a couple of examples of what you should consider as you start to kind of parse what it is that I'm telling you. Or I'm informing you. I apologize. I don't mean to tell you anything, but I'm conveying in a way that I hope blasts through, because unfortunately nobody is and nobody has and nobody will. So therefore, unfortunately, it is up to me. So firstly, Sam Bankman-Fried was of course arrested last week, but now he has been removed from custody in the Bahamas and transferred to New York, where now this is going to go next level. And last night, the Department of Justice arrested, or I should say, have two key players in the executive management of FTX and Alameda that are cooperating with the authorities to piece together what will be a criminal indictment and conviction of Sam Bankman-Fried. Considering, in fact, as I go into this, I just want you to consider that he went on this national celebrity interview tour with the likes of The View, for example, or of course, the New York Times with the old book with Andrew Ross Sorkin and others, and because he was making a case to try to kind of create some confusion to probably buy himself, some leverage in terms of negotiating what ultimately he gives up that he'll eventually go down on. But the mainstream media has been completely complicit in all things Sam Bankman-Fried. Why? He was able to work with celebrities that pumped his bullshit apparatus that led to this absolute disaster. And of course, the mainstream was in on it. So consider that as the sources as I continue to try to devolve and escalate your understanding of what's real versus this facade that this country is under this overwhelming misinformation based on the sources that we should trust, but they don't have the capacity to be able to filter through these sophisticated, complex scenarios that we're in the midst of. But I'm going to marry two together that I think are very prescient, that hopefully will convey what it is that I think is absolutely clear to me, and hopefully will be to millions more soon. So Caroline Ellison, the former CEO of Bankman-Fried's hedge fund Alameda Research, pled guilty to a 7-count criminal indictment, including 2 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, conspiracy to commit commodities fraud, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. What was the cadence and the synchronicity for what they just laid out? Conspiracy. And I'll remind you of that, as we move forward, because the mainstream in a specific arena tends to try to deflate or use conspiracy theory to smack holes in credibility of people that are like, well, wait a second, what about this? But now here we are with the Department of Justice that are using its indictments for these charges based on conspiracy of all of those different elements. That includes Gary Wang, the coding wizard and the former chief technology officer of FTX Trading, who pled guilty to 4 criminal counts, which include conspiracy to commit wire fraud, conspiracy to commit commodities fraud, and conspiracy to commit securities fraud. Yeah, that's what they were doing. they were basically, I mean, as John Ray had pointed out last week, he said it's a simple embezzlement. But really, the entire formula of FTX, which is important in this revelation, this analogy, is that they were taking FTT tokens that their market makers created a value that they traded against their depositors that they backdoored to do uncollateralized trades. That's, by the way, Wall Street. What Sam did was absolutely huge, but it's still absolutely tiny in comparison to what I continue to reveal to you. Gary Gensler, the chair of the SEC, said that as part of their deception, the SEC alleges that Caroline Ellison and Sam Bankman-Fried schemed to manipulate the price of FTT, an exchange crypto security token that was integral to FTX, that propped up the value of their house of cards. We further allege that Ms. Ellison and Mr. Wang played an active role in the scheme to misuse FTX customer assets to prop up Alameda and to post collateral for margin trading. That's exactly what I just told you. When FTT and the rest of the house of cards collapsed, Mr. Bankman-Fried, Ms. Ellison, and Mr. Wang left investors holding the bag. Until crypto platforms comply with the time-tested securities laws, risk to investors will persist. It certainly remains a priority of the SEC to use all of the available tools to bring the industry into compliance. So that's a huge aspect of this, because the whole purpose of crypto and blockchain and Bitcoin was to DeFi because they didn't trust fiat. But in this situation, or central banks as it were, and that was the whole buying capacity of this whole thing. Now there are certain elements of blockchain that are intriguing to me, and I'm learning more every day, but ultimately what I just described to you was a step and repeat. It was a mirror image of what they fancied themselves to be. So out of one side of their mouth, they're saying, we're creating this technology that's transparent so that you don't have to have the risk of central banks and the corruption, if you will, of fiat. Meanwhile, they just did exactly what they learned the mechanics are of what created the 2008 great financial crisis, but it's more than that. It really goes back to the S&L crisis that then evolved into the long-term capital management blowout of the late 90s, that then evolved into the tech boom that then blew up and crested, and then we were replaced by the Enron era frauds that included WorldCom and Tyco. And then, of course, the granddaddy of them all was the 2008 great financial crisis, which to this day, no matter how many mouthpieces with their microphones and their large audiences, either in politics or in media, have no idea what the fucking system was and what the scheme actually was. But yet they want to act like they're experts in 2022 based on some of the elements that I'm telling you, but they can't see the forest for the trees. Once again, the emperor's new clothes on really bad acid. This is a mirror image of what it is that would reveal to you in the con, only the con for comparison's sake. And I'll go through this because this is actually, it's huge. I think, and I want to try to, okay, so basically, you got to understand how large Sam Bankman-Fried's scam was on the amount of volume of customers that he betrayed, in comparison to what a lot of people, for example, in mainstream media, keep comparing him to Bernie Madoff. So ultimately, FTX had 2.7 million user accounts, or I should say FTX US had 2.7 million user accounts, and FTX International had 7.6 million user accounts. That's a total of 10.3 million customers or potential customers, and that's 250 times the size of the defrauded customers of the Bernie Madoff story. If you throw in the mix that Madoff acquired his victims over only a time span of, Bernie Madoff acquired his victims over 4 decades in this con. Sam was able to do it in less than 4 years. And he did that by paying celebrity endorsers of FTX and putting his name on, stadiums around the country. And people just, again, they were chasing what we do in the United States, quick yield, the quick fix, get rich quick, all of those types of things. And now caveat emptor, because regardless of what I told you before about what the SEC is doing, the SEC, of course, is not regulating crypto, especially because it was FTX, Alameda, because it's domiciled in the Bahamas. And the whole thing right now is to protect American consumers. But meanwhile, it's like he hadn't done it, meaning the SEC and Gary Gensler, for like over a year, because it's like, look, we're telling you this whole thing is not legit. And any person who was like going into crypto and Bitcoin without understanding that it's not currency, I don't know what you were investing in other than yield. So buyer beware. You went to the roulette table, you got screwed, sorry. But they are going to bring criminal charges down, and justifiably so, for a lot of reasons. But it's still ironic, all things considered, compared to what they didn't do because of what happened in the 2008 great financial crisis. But I'll come back to that momentarily. So if you consider the customer losses at the other crypto companies that have filed bankruptcy, potentially as a result of their exposure to FTX, the total number of losses may be close to about 18 billion of lost principal. Now, in contrast to the Madoff fraud, currently Ray is acknowledging that 8 billion. Sorry, that was in the Madoff fraud, 18 billion. So currently, Ray acknowledges that 8 billion is missing customer funds, while indicating that records are in disarray and the funds may still be tracked. So it's still a lot smaller, even though there were more customers. So Madoff was just working with a lot wealthier clients, and but that puts it into perspective. But meanwhile, we're talking about what we're talking about. I mean, I've seen that the company was worth, I know Sam was worth 16 billion, but I think it was like, based on the trade valuation, everything else, like 6 months ago, like 64 billion, something like that. In the 2008 great financial crisis, by 2006, the notional value of the derivatives trades were somewhere between 600 trillion and 800 trillion. And that's what blew up the world. So as an alleged and amended complaint, so the CFTC's statement included the following against Ellison and Wang. So as alleged in the amended complaint, Wang created features in the code underlying the FTX trading platform that allowed Alameda to maintain essentially an unlimited line of credit on FTX. As further alleged, Bankman-Fried's direction, FTX executives, including Wang, created other exceptions to FTX standard processes that allowed Alameda to have an unfair advantage when transacting on the platform, including quicker execution times and an exemption from the platform's distinctive auto-liquidation risk management process. These critical code features and structural exceptions allowed Alameda to secretly and recklessly siphon FTX customer assets from the FTX platform. So, that's simply, stealing from the customer's deposits to basically do these simultaneously cross collateral trades baked into a market maker valuation of a token that had no value, which is, again, parallel to the 2008 great financial crisis, except for one giant difference. Wall Street bet the freaking world on a roulette table, but they have the full faith and credit of the United States as a backstop called the Federal Reserve. So they can create, as I've indicated to you over and over and over, liquidity to be able to maximize or to, save these institutions that were bankrupt, which was illegal to begin with. And that's the entire point. But I'll come back to that. So the amended complaint further charges that beginning in October 2021, Ellison was co-chief executive of Alameda and later sole CEO, and along with Bankman-Fried and others, Ellison directed Alameda to use billions of dollars of FTX funds, including FTX customer funds, to trade on other digital assets and to fund a variety of high-risk digital asset industry investments. As further alleged, Ellison made deceptive public statements in her capacity as Alameda CEO, including statements about the supposed separation between the operations of Alameda and FTX in order to facilitate and perpetuate a fraud scheme. Bankman-Fried was extradited to the United States and the Bahamas, and his 8-count criminal indictment has the potential for 115 years in prison. So they're moving on this based on deceptive acts and practices of a fraud scheme. Now let's contrast that just briefly with what ultimately was revealed from the January 6th committee with regards to Donald Trump and the insurrection and their criminal referrals that are now to the Department of Justice, in addition to everything else that's being investigated from the New York AG's office and the Southern District of Manhattan also, as well as, of course, the Department of Justice. Interestingly, not any SEC involvement with any of the Trump enterprises, and I'm sure that's because They weren't public. They were private. I would imagine. So the charges included obstruction. These are the criminal referrals to the Department of Justice. Obstruction of official proceeding, which of course was the election. The entirety of the insurrection was to basically hogtie what Congress was voting on to secure the victory for Joe Biden, which of course became the big lie. Now, I've always held, by the way, that Steve Bannon and others within Trump's universe have seen the con, understand what we pressed forward, and I believe they adapted some of these ideas to conflate what ultimately became their strategy, which was the big lie. Because what we continue to perpetuate in revelations of the 2008 great financial crisis is we claim in all of our messaging, particularly in our marketing messaging, that this was the largest criminal conspiracy in the history of the world, financial criminal conspiracy, that was covered up. But the real story is it never ended. And nobody understands what actually happened before, so it continues to this day. However, as I've just demonstrated with the Sam Bankman-Fried, indictments and everything that's involved with his co-executives, is that they have shown, indicted, conspiracy on an assortment of different crimes. Because it always takes more than one person to pull this off, which is a conspiracy, which isn't theory. When you say conspiracy theory, you are saying that to discredit those that are trying to put the pieces together, especially because it's very difficult to find and aggregate the evidence to prove a case, which is, of course, what happens in our courts, and that's what's supposed to happen. But if it doesn't, then it's up to the citizens to figure it out, which is what we did at great expense, at great sacrifice, that took years and years and years to put all together, but then ultimately landed with a thud. Because all of the other noise of this disinformation and this ocean of lies has your attention. But meanwhile, as I'm demonstrating to you, all of the thumbprints and the DNA of this situation reverts back to what it is that I'm trying to convey to you. So you have to understand at just the base level of the universe, the structure of atoms and molecules, you can't see. But they create everything that sustains you and creates everything that we're all about. But they're everywhere. That's what it feels like to try to convey this notion of corruption to you, because you have to understand who did what, when, and how. Unfortunately, in an era where your bandwidth is like this, and you're overwhelmed with so much misinformation that you don't know which direction the sky is, or whatever metaphor makes the most sense. But moving forward with the criminal referrals from Congress based on their hearings. The second, and this one was the most important, and this is again reverting back to Donald Trump, conspiracy to defraud the United States. Conspiracy to defraud the United States. What he was doing was he was feeding misinformation to the public based on information that he knew that there was real numbers that were coming through that he was lying about to be able to foster this paranoia and disbelief, because nobody can believe anything because they're lied to all the time. And when the whole world, like Jon Snow said, is a race to the bottom with better and better lies, then nothing means anything. Well, yes, that's what we're dealing with, because we live in an era of just absolute deception, puppeteered by those with the most money, which means the most interest and the most entrenched interests and everything else, much of which the committee, the January 6th committee, hasn't even touched, because the conspiracy that they're referring to is just a handful of players, not the big money on the outside that I keep trying to bring to your attention, like, for example, the Koch brothers or the Mercers or, Adelson's, foundation and all that type of stuff that would enable them to get all of the mercenaries and fund these guys and be coordinated, because Blackwater was involved, which is, of course, why can't I think of his name? The guy, it was Eric Prince, right? Who's been a mercenary since the beginning of the Iraq War. And I mean, this guy with all of his hired guns are as tough and badass as it gets, because he hires the best professionals to protect the worst actors on the planet. It feels very, to me, if you've seen the movie that was just re-released, James Cameron's, second installment of Avatar, that kind of is like the military force that's gun for hires on Pandora. That's what it feels like when I look at Blackwater, for example, but happening, in the insurrection and all of the things that followed what was going on in Black Lives Matter. So those are the first two almost insane criminal referrals, considering what I'm telling you. Again, they're demonstrating conspiracy, okay? And you're seeing that there's a remedy for that, because that's the law. We have structured laws to combat this type of deceptive behavior. And yet, if the law doesn't actually do that, there's a reason for that, and it's called corruption. Moving forward, the third criminal referral: conspire to make false statements based on the electoral certifications. Now, as we watch, for example, Rachel Maddow and the MSNBC crew specifically, they have been on this for some time. And Rachel justifiably goes like Rachel Maddow loony on this whole thing. She's like, oh my God, they were dummying up documentation fabrication to create electoral certification fraud that Rudolph Giuliani, ironically, who was one of the top cops in the United States based on RICO as the, Attorney General. Well, was he Attorney General of New York or was he DA? I got to go back to that. But during the 70s, when they were trying to snuff out, the 5 crime families of New York, they used RICO to do it. Racketeering, influence, corrupt organization. We have, again, remedies for this type of behavior if only you have the courage and the commitment to the law, that no man or corporation is above the law. And that's the idea of the United States. However, we have not been using these laws for 20 plus years. Just so you know, this is kind of a new rub on an old scenario, but yet there is ways you can cherry pick and get certain bad actors in the system that you want to take down if you have the power, and justifiably so in the case like I opened up. I mean, Trump is guilty of this and so much more. However, what he is a mid-level player at best. And moving forward to the final criminal referral, of course, is to incite an insurrection. I mean, that's treason. Okay, that's what Trump did. It's treason. But working with Vladimir Putin based on laundering money through New York real estate wasn't treason enough before he got elected president. 74 million people against Biden voted for Trump after he had already been proven to have lied over 5,000 times and been involved with these murky relationships that were just insane. But ultimately, the mainstream media cherry picks and they don't go all the way, because I've got this theory that if they did go all the way, then they'd have to reveal the stuff that I'm revealing to you, which of course they don't, because they don't want to. And I'll give you a final paragraph from a New York Times board op-ed this morning that kind of builds all of these things together. Not so much Sam Bankman-Fried, but with respect to the January 6th insurrection. And this is their final, their concluding paragraph, and really the point of everything that I do. They said, look, we remain in strange and uncharted waters, yet the hearings underscore that the country is better off with clarity and truth. Well, no shit. That's the New York Times op-ed board saying what we all expect. So again, like, the easiest metaphors have always been for me, when you're driving through your city, you expect the lights to work. There's rules so that we don't all pile drive into each other and have absolute chaos. When you go to the airport and you get on a plane, you expect that plane to fly. You don't necessarily have to understand how the plane flies with detail. You just expect it to get you from point A to point B safely, as is your right. And in the market, if we knew that there was an airline that was designed to sabotage us 1 out of every 10 times that we got on the plane, chances are we wouldn't buy tickets because we're not going to play roulette with our life. But meanwhile, we do that with our government. We do that with our financial system because of what I've been trying to tell you. Yes, it's a mammoth conspiracy. It's not rocket science. It's racketeering. And when you have the truth, you're bulletproof. I need you to believe me when I tell you I have the answers. Just some regular guy. There's nothing special about me. I don't part the waters. I don't walk on water. I wasn't sent here by God. I don't hear voices from God. I just happen to be a guy that is relentless when I try to understand what the heck is really going on in my world. And when I found out I've gotten played, I fight. I fight because I'm tenacious, and maybe if anything, I'm a little bit like Popeye when I open up a can of spinach and I'm battling Bluto. But in this case, Bluto is the system. You've got to understand, people, that we have been betrayed by professionals in this country. We have to rely on people, for example, going back to the metaphor about expecting the plane to fly. We don't have just a random person flying the airplane every time we get on it. We have a pilot. That pilot has trained and got the job because he has over, I don't even know what the baseline is anymore, but you have to have probably 100,000 hours of flight time before you're a commercial pilot. That's an extraordinary amount, and I can tell you firsthand that if you endeavor yourself into something for more than 10,000 hours, chances are you're going to actually be very good at it. I've got hundreds of thousands of hours into this topic that I'm explaining to you. There's a methodology of how CEOs in this country get every piece of the puzzle within companies to be able to ultimately provide credit or products that you'll delve into that that are an illusion for a big sort of short-term profit margin that reflects on the way we interpret, probably the vitality or the strength of the economy based on short-term numbers, but it's a facade that can be manipulated. That ultimately, when you create this dynamic, Gresham's dynamic, with perverted incentives for short-term upside, what you find is you'll get the most vicious people in the system to do whatever it is that they need to get those numbers to where they need to get them, which is based on deceptive acts and practices. Going back to Donald Trump and the insurrection and the four criminal referrals that Congress just made to Department of Justice. Deceptive acts and practices, right? Lying, stealing, and deceiving. And this is really a huge point that I have to underlie here. When Rachel Maddow is referring to the elector certification documentation fabrication and the story that I've been bringing to you, networks in the pipeline of the real estate vertical, known as brokers, lenders, underwriters, the appraisal arm of the process, and then also the stopgaps of the ratings agencies, are all built in to make sure that that value of that product is what they say it is, especially if they're going to sell securities, because then they have to fit within the law and the purview of what's known as, reps and warranties. Just like what the criminal referrals are saying that Trump was guilty of, deceptive acts and practices based on warranties, in so much that people were providing money to the charity to keep Donald Trump going because he was saying it was a massive con and that the election was being stolen when he knew that it wasn't. That's deceptive acts and practices. Meanwhile, tens of millions of felonies occurred using documentation fraud to get people approved for loans that are known as liar's loans. It's not subprime, it's liar's loans. They're ninja loans. No job, no income, no asset, okay? No job, asset. The bottom line is they were myth, but yet they were sold through the pipeline as having a specific collateral value that was AAA that ultimately was sold to pensions and municipalities and governments that were designed to blow up. They did. They blew up the world in 2008 based on a criminal enterprise that had tens of millions of felonies using all of the same things that are on display now, and in the end, using mythical collateral that was at the end, after they blew up the world, that was at this point worth zero. The Federal Reserve reached around extraordinary scenarios based on statutes that are just the basics of lending. You don't lend to somebody who's bankrupt, especially at the same rate you would if they were AAA, right? And you don't do it if you know knowingly that they created the deceptive acts and practices through a criminal pipeline to create that product that blew up the world. You don't then step in to A, not prosecute the CEOs that were responsible for this whole thing, and B, you don't give them tens of trillions of dollars. But that's what we did. And we've continued to do. Quantitative easing was the next step that lasted since 2012 till now, so maybe it's 2010, I think. 10 to 12 years of this distortion racket that ultimately provides the criminal syndicate an endless flow of capital to destroy you. That's our system. And it's much bigger than Trump. It's much bigger than Sam Bankman-Fried. It's much bigger than anything you can possibly imagine, except for if you watch The Con, then you'll wrap your head around the entire bit of it at www.thecon.tv, or if you go to my Truth Bomb page on YouTube at Patrick Lovell Truth Bombs The Con, watch the 11/1/22 Deception Owns You. I lay out the filibuster in a 10-hour filibuster of the United States, all of the details of what took place that led to tens of millions of people being set up and bulldozed in courts by our justice system illegally, using documentation fraud to bury millions of innocent people that are now just like, where do I go? And many of them, unfortunately, end up in the MAGA camp because they want to tear the whole thing down. Many of them are the ones who showed up on the January 6th insurrection. I still, to this day, cannot believe, after everything that's happened since 2000, and I'm talking 9/11, I'm talking about wars that didn't need to happen because we never went after Saudi Arabia when Saudi was deeply immersed in the 9/11 attacks. But I don't think Saudi ever actually engineered the whole thing. I just think that they were involved, they were part of it. I think it was an inside job, and I don't think it was Israel by any stretch and all that truther shit. But I do think it was the oil industry / financial system / CIA that was very much a part of this. Don't know all the details, just know enough to know that the FBI knew exactly what was going on with all of the terrorists in our country that they could have thwarted in a nanosecond, but chose not to. And then we had 9/11, then we had 20 years of war. 2008 is a very similar situation. Asymmetric information based on deceptive acts and practices and fraud by CEOs of the biggest, most recognized, I guess respected institutions in this country that were nothing but fraud shops. And then ultimately the government allowed them to get away with it. Why? It's called revolving door. So when President Barack Obama wrote his populist wave of change we could believe in, the first thing he did when he came into office was he put all of the people that designed this thing that blew up the world in positions of power to clean it up. Most notably, from Covington and Burling, the law firm that is, I think, equidistant between the White House and the Treasury Department, who's been around since the Civil War, one of the most elite white shoe law firms in the country, gave us Eric Holder, who was the Attorney General of the United States. Why is that important? Well, because in the ramp up to the blowout in 2008, it was Covington and Burling that did the legal work for what was known as the MERS, Mortgage Electronic Registration System, that was then used later with, millions of documentation fraud with robo-signers that basically, bulldozed millions of people in the courts illegally. And they all did that without anybody knowing it. Nobody was made whole. Nobody went to jail. Nobody understood what exactly happened. And that just opened up the, basically this Pandora's box to hell. Because without accountability and without integrity of the law, the bad guys can win. And they continue to win. And they continue to win because they're more ambitious, they're more organized, and they're just more committed than you are. I used to say, after 9/11, I would say things like, we as Americans have to love liberty and justice for all more than the terrorists want to go see Allah for 17 versions. We have to have that sort of, foundational just power, because when you do, that goes to my point always, when you have the truth, you're bulletproof and you can withstand the storm, this insanity, and you can defeat it. I underestimated what I was getting involved with when I tried to pull the threads to understand what didn't make sense after the 2008 financial crisis. This many years later, it all makes complete sense. But what I underestimated was twofold. The lengths of depravity that the system of corruption will go to control us all, and B, the complicity of millions of people who can't literally put 1 + 1 = 2. It's the emperor's new clothes. I'm the guy who's got the truth. I don't walk on water, but I do believe in liberty and justice for all. I need to somehow galvanize millions of you to walk with me in a specific direction, to blow holes in all of this so that the truth can overcome the madness of lies. If you want if you want why can't I even think of the term? When we're, not cultural, but it'll come to me in a minute. But I just, look no further than Game of Thrones and the character Jon Snow fighting the army of the dead. He just basically makes a very simple calculation. If we don't come together to defeat the army of the dead, we're all dead. Corruption has destroyed every empire in the history of the world, and it always does it through conformity. I need people of independence who understand right from wrong, who are citizens, to come together under the banner of truth. And we've got to do it now. There's no time to waste. Onwards and upwards. I just made a promise to myself that I was going to find the answer.